Hey gang, welcome back to Joe Daddy's Garage. Today's video is part 16 in the 68 Mustang fastback build known as Fangled. Now in the last video I worked on the back of the car and I finished up some fitment of the tail panel and checking the fit of the deck lid and the extensions and all that sort of thing. And as you know, this entire car is pretty much made from dynacorn parts. I've also added a roll bar inside. I went through the process of that, showing you how I installed that and welded it in place. And now I'm moving to the front of the car. As you can see, I've relocated things in the garage. I had my 69 Mach 1, known as my Mach 1, up here on the lift. I've moved that out of the way so that I can set this car in place, get to work on the front suspension system that's going in, this TCI. And then I'll be able to lift this car off of my jig that I built so I can work on the back of the car as well. So I'm going to go through the steps of these pieces and parts fitting onto these front frame rails. I've done a video on this before on the 66 convertible known as Brooklyn Pony, and essentially these are the same parts. Now I think they've made some changes to their design, and I point out in those previous videos I had problems with parts that didn't want to fit the rear frame rails, and I think TCI has addressed that, but I'm working on the front right now. So I'm going to go through the parts that I have and lay them out, and we'll take a look at the process of putting this together. So as you saw, I removed the core support. Now in most cases that would be welded in, but I think I want to leave it open so I have more access to these frame rails. I don't see it making any difference at all. These frame rails are not going to move, and before I weld anything, I will actually clamp the core support back in place to make sure it's going to fit. Now, I have this pile of parts over here on my roll-around dolly, and there's a whole bunch of stuff on here. Some of it is directly related to the suspension and braking system. Some of it is not. Like there's a set of headers here, and these pieces will just be separated, and we'll go through them. Also point out that there is a Coyote engine going in this, and there is the Ford 9-inch rear end, and along with this, all this stack of parts, inside the car I have other pieces. So I have this support structure which acts as kind of like a frame connector for the rear suspension, and then these pieces which interact with this. So this will come later on. I just wanted to show you there's more pieces to this than just what you see in this pile. So I'm going to separate this stuff and organize it so that I know what goes to the front of the car and what will eventually go to the back. For now, I have separated everything I need to put the front together. So this is the main cross member. I will not be needing these because this is for a block off if you cut off your shock towers. And we're using frame rails from dynacorn that those were already eliminated. So these pieces are now surplus. Over here I have the side plate that will mount in this location. These are different from side to side. So just point that out. There's a specific dimension here for this hole, and then it follows this radius. And then down here we have this piece which has a subtle curve to it. That's going to go on the bottom of the frame rail. And then on the inside, on both sides, we have this piece. So this obviously is specific to side, and all of this is going to be tied together but what you have to do is trim off this flange. So I will be removing probably this entire section of the flange here, and then they want you to weld that back together. The reason you have to do that is this piece is going to sit on top of this, and there's no way to do that with this back section. So you look at that nice thick shoulder there. If you try to set that up on top, there's no way that's going to fit. So that's why you have to trim that down. And these are specific from side to side. If you'll notice, here's an offset of these openings, and you have this little tab right here that's going to interact with this location. Now I'll point out, these do not fit exact. Like, this is the hole that was for the idler arm, and this hole, I guess they're trying to get you to use whatever's there, but you know, that hole, of course, dictates where the idler arm sits. So I don't expect these to be perfect. You know, they're doing a rough cut on these for the most part. They're trying to follow this radius of this curve right here. So there may be some adjusting that needs to happen to get that exactly where I want it. And then on this side, same situation. They're using this hole in the back that is for your steering. So if I move this forward a little bit, I can get that hole to line up, but there's nothing here, even though there's a few holes in that location. Now, as a comparison, I have this original frame rail, and if I put it on top of this, even on the original, it doesn't necessarily line up exactly like it's supposed to. I mean, it's just the way these things can have variations in them, so not that big a concern. I'm just pointing that out. Also, these are your sway bar brackets, and these will go underneath the frame rail. And being that these are aftermarket frame rails that have nothing on them, we don't have to worry about cutting things off. So as I was going through the instructions, there's a lot of things on here that they're covering that aren't really going to pertain to this process, because most of this stuff is already gone. Like, they're telling you to take, you know, cut your springs right there, whatever. Plasma cutting pieces off, the shock towers, cutting those out, and then this is where they're talking about removing that lower flange, and so that'll happen. And then they're telling you to be cautious to not remove too much material, because you have to weld those two together, and they're showing that there. So I will still have to do that with that flange section that is right above that plate. And then they show this welded together and fitting these pieces in place. Here's the inner piece that I talked about, and then they go through the process of putting the outer plate on and welding things together. Now, I also point out, I was looking at this, and again, it's been a while since I've done one of these, but as they're clamping these all together, one thing they talk about is this flange out here, which is this flange. And they want you to put these plates on first, from what I'm reading. Put the plate on, and then grind down or cut off this flange, because you're going to tie all these pieces together. So if you're just welding to this location, you're relying on these spot welds here, and they don't want you to do that. From what I'm gathering, as this piece goes up underneath, that's going to tie all of that together. So you have to expose this edge so that you can add weld along that edge. Hope that makes sense. I'm going to continue on, and as I make progress, you'll see the results. I also wanted to point out that I went through this box, and it had this hardware. So this is the Mustang torque arm rear suspension, installation sheet, and hardware. There's the bolt kit for the subframe bolt kit, and there's a torque arm 3-link strut kit. So I'm going to assume, you know how that is, all that goes to the back of the car. Up here, I didn't point this out, but these are the lower control arms Inside here we have the rotors and calipers, and this is a kit for like the sway bar, and you can see that carrier right there. There's shocks in these two boxes. There's other hardware, there's brake lines and brackets and different things. But what I wanted to find as I was going through this, there's a Mustang panel bolt kit. I think that's for the shock tower covers if you were going to use them. What I wanted to find was this kit, because this is specific to the installation of these pieces and parts. So I'll be using these to locate various pieces of metal that are going to be welded on. As many of you know, I love to use a plasma cutter when I can. However, I didn't want the hot sparks, the molten metal, blowing over towards my trash can area, and it just made more sense to use the cutoff wheel, this 4.5-inch grinder, and then my small disc grinder or ziz wheel cutter to make these final cuts in order to get this piece of metal out of the way. And there it goes. Okay, now I'm sanding down the edges here, and as I'll show later in this video sequence, I realized that the inner plate needed a little more room. That forward section just wasn't quite enough, and these pieces need to interact well together, so I modify that to make sure everything is going to fit before I weld. So I want to show you a detail. As I cut this out with that 4.5-inch grinder, I prefer that over the plasma cutter simply because I don't want sparks flying all over the place. But I set the inner piece up in place, and I noticed I've got a gap right here. So that tells me I need to do something different. I trimmed this piece at an angle, assuming that there would be enough room, but there's not. And if I could leave that angle, but I would have to trim back the edge of this piece, and I don't want to do that because when you come out here and you line up this piece, you can see these two ends need to be in contact. So this needs to be welded, these two need to be welded together. So what I'll do is I'll trim this out. I may make it a little tiny bit of a radius. I don't know if I can pull that off because I don't want to make this opening any bigger here. Or it may just have to be just a tiny little curve here at the bottom. But I think I'll leave this one alone, at least at this point, while I'm testing up these pieces. So keep that in mind. You may have to make some adjustments based on how this piece is going to fit. And I was just using, doesn't even show up very well on this, but there's an angle, and it's covered up by that piece. It was more exposed on this one. So there's a lot of variables to these things. You might need to address that. Now, I don't say that I over-engineer or re-engineer often, but when I look at things and I see how they interact, I can see room for improvement. So if I slide this back, line up that hole in the back roughly, and now this fits flush here. But if you'll notice, it actually overhangs the frame rail. And so as I was working on this, I realized it actually covers up this outer portion. It hides it. So if you put the other piece up there, these two create a box, and if you're going to try to weld that seam together, you're going to end up with a big weld in the way with little penetration. And what I mean by that is these two flanges, if you just welded them on that 90 degree, or the corner, then you end up with grinding that weld down to make this fit on top of it and make the other piece fit as well. So what I decided to do is actually back cut this lower one. I just took out some extra material so that I could weld this together, have a nice connection between these two flanges, and grind it down and still have this covered up. So just some things to look at. I don't know that it's necessary, but I know when I look at things, I try to think, how can I make this as strong as possible based on what their design is. And they talked about not removing too much material here, but I can weld that and create a nice corner and have great connection. So what I want to do now is weld this together, and I may come up into these ends just a little, but I'll grind that back down I'm more concerned with the center section. I measured this. The metal is 14 gauge. So I have set the yeswelder DP200 to 14 gauge, and I'm using 30 thousandths wire, and I'm going to weld this together. Now I don't know if I'll do a continuous weld or not, because there is a gap there, and I'm filling that gap. So anytime you're filling a gap, you can generate a lot of heat, and I don't want to burn through any of this, so I'll just tack it in a couple spots just to keep it tight. I know this is tedious, but as you can hear, when I start welding, it's going to want to, burn through those edges. So I'm just taking my time, make it nice. Nice, I like it. So I'll do some grinding on that, make sure the plates fit, and we'll go on to the next step. Okay, I have ground the side and the top. Everything appears to be flush. And now I'm going to move on to mounting these two plates. So I'm going to reset the camera so you can see what I'm going to do. So in the bolt kit, you have a 7/16 bolt. That goes to the driver's side, and the 3/8 goes to the passenger side. And the idea is you're going to bolt the plate in place on the frame rail. So you set this up in here, and you can see everything fits flush now. I've got the nice tight fit here, and these corners where these little cutouts are, all that fits nice and snug. Take that bolt, you'll line it up, put it through, and then, so they tell you to put this plate here, obviously, and I'll point out, it just doesn't pop on. So this bottom edge right now is fighting the fitment. They talk about having this fit as close to, perfect parallel or, 90 degrees, but I can't do that right now because this bottom edge is not fitting. So what I'm going to do is grind this down, make it fit nice, and that'll help it get up into that correct location. Right now it's just fighting. So, I can force it, but I don't do that. So I got to get this back edge cleaned up, and then we'll try again. That's not as good as I want it. This is not parallel, so this needs to rotate down. I can see there's a gap here at the front, and it's probably still in that area. I don't want to modify the hole, but to get that to come down, it needs some clearance. That's pretty close, but I want just a little more out of this, just to be on the safe side. Yeah, that looks good. So now everything looks really good. There will be more modifications to this lower section, and we'll deal with that later on. But for now, this says I can weld it together. So maybe I'll just do that. So with these pieces fitting together very nicely, I put some tack welds on, and then I just started welding on that front edge. Figured it's not going to go anywhere, and I worked my way up towards the top section here and welded that as well. Now, of course, the inside of this is where that corner was, and I know that it's good and tight. There's no conflict with any of that. I know it's solid on the inside. I probably could have opened up this gap a little to make sure that welded into the previous weld, but you really wouldn't gain much from it. So I tack weld the bottom section here, and really I may have overthought this a little bit. I don't need to keep the clamps on there at this point. Nothing's going to move. These things are in a fixed location. So I went ahead and welded that bottom edge, and as I talk about later in the video, you have to cut out a section where this coil spring or the coilover shock is going to fit, and they want you to have some relief in that area. So on this side, I welded the base of that seam to the flange of the frame rail, but on the other side I weighted. It just made it, well, it really didn't make much difference. You could have welded it and ground it down and then re-welded it or re-weld it, but I decided in this case just to weld that bottom flange, make sure everything was tight. And you can see I'm going back and forth on these welds, letting it cool a little bit here and there, and then a little more filler work up at that top where the inner weld met that outer weld, and then take care of this bottom edge, make sure that's good and solid and filled in. And from there, I address just little areas that need to be taken care of. Then I went back to the back and finished welding that last bit of the flange where it meets the frame rail. So at this point, I've welded the full perimeter of the outer plate and most of the perimeter of the inner plate. I did not do the bottom flange just yet. That's coming. However, I did take a grinder or sander and make this a corner again. Instead of having weld there, now it's a square corner because this piece needs to fit there and line up with that hole. So that fits super nice. Very happy with that. The next step they mention is working on this bottom plate. Now you'll notice this has a flat edge that goes to the inside. So the opposite plate is going to be the other direction. It's not going to have this curved cutout here on the bottom. They do use the existing mount hole here that's for the crossmember. And even though I don't necessarily like doing this, I'm going to do what they tell me. This insert underneath here sticks out that much. But if you grind it off, you don't have anything to mount to. And I don't want to do that. So what they want you to do is take this bolt and run it up into that hole, bottom it out, which I'll have to tighten that up. But then what will happen is this will compress up against the bottom here, and then they want you to trace this opening right here. So it's hard to tell, there's this curve. sets back behind this. So they're wanting you to trim this back. I'm going to follow I'll probably follow the whole pattern all the way back to here, because it needs to be welded, and I want all these flanges welded together. So this bolt doesn't want to run up in there right now. I'm going to have to check that, run the nut up in there, and then trace this bottom edge. They tell you to use a grinder and grind it off. I may take a cutoff wheel and cut the bulk of it off and then finish it and get all this to match. So I'll get started on that, and then we'll see how much further we can get today. So I want to show you this side. I've welded all the top edge all the way around the back and that bottom edge, but I have not done the complete bottom section just yet. This will get welded after I address the plate on the bottom. Now the instructions are saying what they want you to do is bolt that plate in, and I have, and then they're saying to weld here, like weld this completely together. And then on the outside it talks about cutting out for the coilover, so there needs to be a recess here. So I'm going to show you this. This is the curve here they're talking about. Now as I look at this, and again I tend to over-engineer or re-engineer things, I realize that this flange is part of the outer portion of the frame rail, right? You can see it overhang a lot here. And up here we have this cutout, which is a factory cutout. And I'm thinking that if I trim this, I'm left with this little section right here that is not affected. So what I want to do, I think, I may start back here at this notch, trim this out all the way up to this area right here, and let it just blend in, and then weld all of that back together. And then the back section here, leave this alone from there back, otherwise I'll end up cutting off this whole outer flange for no reason. So it can stop right there, and I can, you know, I still got to weld this bottom plate all the way back in this area anyway. So that's the plan right now. I think it's looking pretty good. Now after the plates are on, it talks about drilling a 3/8 hole. You'll notice, and this is just the way it is, this hole is not related to that hole in the frame rail. This hole, if you look across, is related to that same hole that's on the inside. The reason for that is they're going to have us take this piece of metal and these bolts, and the bolt is going to run through both of those plates. So it'll go through the outer and also come through the inner hole. And the idea is, as seen here in the instructions, they're drilling these holes, and this is shown after that bottom plate's welded in, but they use that as a guide so that it helps you square up the crossmember. So once you get the crossmember in place, this plate is going to keep it from, you know, shifting around. That's the idea. So it's supposed to help square it up, and then I'll go through the detail, taking a little square to make sure that everything is straight, so that the crossmember is straight with the frame rails. It also gives you a dimension here from the front of the frame rail. The measure should be 24 3/8 inches. I believe they're saying it's to the front of, from the front of the crossmember, front face of the crossmember to the front of the frame rail, 24 3/8 inches. So gives you a measurement there, and of course they're showing this all clamped in place and everything to make sure it's going to stay, and then a heavy weld, and then they work on fitting these control arm and shock mounts. So we'll deal with that later. For now, I'm just going to work on getting that area, cut out and then get all that welded. Just so you know, when you do this, there will be a lot of grinding debris. So I did cut this back. You can see it matches the way I wanted it to. And it says to weld all that together. Now I don't know, I'm assuming they have enough clearance built in, because they talked about cutting this back for clearance of the coil. And you know, there's going to be a weld built up here, so I'm assuming that weld will not affect that. But I will weld all this in, get it welded on the bottom, and of course on the inside as well. And then I'll move on to finishing up the driver's side. Then I think the next step is setting up or drilling those holes as I mentioned, and then getting the main crossmember in place. So now we're committed. That bottom plate is in place, and I'm just going to start welding things together. Now on this midsection here where I had that cutout, I put a lot of weld on this, and you can see I'm making a lot of movement with the wand here, or the whip, and I'm trying to fill in as much as I can with weld, because the plan will be to grind that back out. I don't want to have it just protruding into the coil spring area, so I added a lot of weld, and then I blended it back down so it had a nice transition. And here I'm just welding that back section of the lower plate. Then I move to the other side, then I do the same thing. And this is what I was talking about earlier, where I had welded that bottom edge of the inner on the passenger side, or say, I should say the outer plate, but in this case I welded it all at the same time. It really doesn't make much difference. These welds are nice and heavy, and this metal's so thick that everything's going to stay together. Weld the back edge on that lower plate as well, and then a little more filler work here and there where it's needed to finish that off, and that'll be it for the lower plate. So at this point I have all three pieces welded completely together around the whole perimeter around the frame rail. I've also drilled the hole that was right there, went all the way through with a 3/8 inch drill bit, and I've placed one of the plates with the bolt in that location. But also I want to show you that I took and I ground down this corner, made it as square as I possibly could, and also the bottom section here is also square. I did the whole thing because when this piece sits up in there, this corner ends up against here. So I just went ahead and ground the whole thing, did it on both sides, and I think it looks pretty nice. Same thing on the top, as I talked about earlier, the plates that go on top that hold the upper control arm, they also fit square onto this. So this piece, I'm going to put it on that side as well. So basically, put that bolt through that opening, put the nut on the outside, and then what I was using on the other side, it shows I'm using a little T-square, or a little square. I have this combination square here, and what I want to do is make this straight and then tighten up this nut. And that should be all you need to do for the placement of the crossmember. So I'm going to work on getting that where it needs to be and try to show you that process. that should be in the right spot. Should be. We'll take some measurements and verify that. Okay, now it's showing a measurement of 24 3/8 from the front face, and look at that. That's right on 24 3/8 to the front face of the frame rail. Go up against. Lo and behold, 24 3/8. All right, I need to do a little preparation here so that I'm ready to weld all this together. As I always say, test fit, test fit, test fit. So I will do everything I can to make sure this is as square as possible. They do show taking just a little square and going against the inside of the frame rail, coming in from like the back and checking that it's square. So I feel like I've already accomplished that with the little blocks and using the square as well. But I will double check all this stuff before I do any more welding. So as you know, I test fit things all the time, and I'm very happy with how this looks. I feel like it's in the right spot. I don't have any doubts about that based on the measurements and everything else. But one thing I was looking at was the mounts. So you can see it has these upper mounts here, and I don't know what those correspond to. I don't know if these are, somebody had mentioned that this crossmember looks like a big block crossmember. So I'm assuming, again, you know how that is, assuming that those are for a big block. However, we are not doing that. We're putting in a Coyote. So the owner has provided me with this kit from welderseries.com. And this kit consists of 4 plates, some bolts and hardware, and these 2 pieces right here, which are the engine mounts. So these have 3 mount holes, and you can tell by this little stand here that's holding the engine up, there's a hole there, and then there's more down below. So essentially this is going to bolt in that location. That's my assumption. I don't see why it would fit any other way. If I tried to use the other one, that would put the mount way too far back. I mean, like way behind the 3rd cylinder on the right side, or the driver's side here. So let's just say this goes here. Now that's fine. And I was looking at this setup that's in the car, or we're going to be using, and I don't know if that's going to work. I mean, it might work, but this has a bushing kit and has some bolts with it, but I don't think they're going to be the right ones, at least not for using those mounts. What I may end up doing, and we'll see how it goes, I may end up having to trim off some of this and using these pieces to make mounts for it. So just something that, you know, I'm looking at as I go through the process and making sure everything is going to interact the way it should, or at least the way I hope it should. So just something to think about. These bolts here, these mount bolts, I know it's hard to tell, but they're not long enough for that function. And you can see it has these bushings in there. So we'll see what happens, but I will be continuing to work through this, because one of the ideas I've had is to get a plastic engine block to simulate that, and a transmission that you can bolt together. It's plates that you bolt together that will simulate the transmission as well. So that may be coming. As I always say, test fit, test fit, test fit. So the core support, it fits. I did have to clamp, put vice grips on it to squeeze it a little bit together, and I think that's just the way things are. You know, whenever, without the cross member in, these frame rails would move slightly side to side and they would easily conform. But now that I have that rigid crossmember sitting in there, it doesn't want to fit quite as well as I want it to. Not a big concern. It's fine the way it is. It's not going anywhere. But what I wanted to show you was one of the things they talked about in the instructions was the angle of this crossmember, like this way, fore and aft, towards the bottom. And what I have determined is, let me get up here. Looking down on it, of course, this is pretty close to dead on 90. You're not going to change that. But if I go this way, I don't know how well it shows up, but I can see a little bit of a gap at the bottom. And I can manipulate this a little to the back. What I found is it's actually going to need some blending. So like this edge right here, now you can see the gap a little better. I may clean up this back edge, this mating surface, so that it can pivot slightly. And this is kind of a weird location because this is where that the crossmember bolt was. If you remember, bolt went up through, and whenever you do this, that insert stays in there. So it kind of deforms this plate a little bit. Not a huge concern, but I want to trim up this side on both sides of the crossmember and get it to angle back just a little bit more to where I'll feel better about it. Now, I'm not being overly aggressive here. I'm just trying to knock down that back edge just to give it a little more room to move. And then I decided to clean up all the edges and chamfer them just a little bit so that when it is welded together, it has a little more area to penetrate and make for a good solid weld. So I do this on both sides. I take care of that, like I said, that back corner, knock it down, and then I do the same on the driver's side. And it doesn't take much. I just want to have a little more room to make those adjustments. And what I ended up doing was I put a bar in the mount point for the lower control arm, and I pushed down on it just a little bit while I tack welded the pieces in. And that way I didn't have to rely on it staying in place with the clamp. Resetting this back in place, and these bar clamps that I've had for years sure do come in handy for stuff like this. In the video, or in the pictures they show in the instructions, they use a great big C-clamp, but this works out really well using these bar clamps. So I've already tack welded the crossmember into place before I did this welding. I verified the alignment and everything was square, and then I worked on making sure this thing was going to be good and solid. I really do love welding this thick metal, and this yeswelder DP200 did a fine job. I have no complaints about it, and all of these welds I actually did at full amperage with the 110 setting. And there's no doubt in my mind this thing will not come apart unless it's a catastrophic event. That's not going anywhere. Now what I'm doing is getting the core support out of the way. Like I said, I want to make sure everything's going to fit prior to any of the welding. And now that crossmember is in, it's not going anywhere. So I'm very confident with it. Now what I want to do is start welding in these other exposed areas of the crossmember. I could have mounted the outer brackets at the same time, but I just decided to go ahead and do these short runs on the front and the back on both sides, and that's doesn't really change anything. You end up with a good solid weld, and you can add more to that whenever you add the other part. So here's where we're at. I have welded in the main cross member, and you saw in the time lapse it's fully welded around the base, so it's not going anywhere. Now in the sequence of pictures they show this piece, this upper mount, interacts at the same time. Like this bolt right here, whenever you're welding in that lower cross member, it says not to finish weld the inside or weld in the hole where this bolt goes. Like what they want you to do is tack weld in the cross member and then refit this piece based on this bolt going through this little loop they have right there. Now I just welded this in. I know it's not going to matter, and then I went to put this in place, and I discovered that the hole that this bolt goes through was not big enough, so that 3/8 bolt would not go through that hole. I had to take a drill and open it up a little bit just to make it fit, and that was on both sides. Same situation. So before I had that plate here and it went up against the cross member. So I've taken that plate off, and like I said, I welded that. Now I stopped short here because this all welds together at the same time. So you've got this perimeter weld here, this corner weld, this corner, and then you fill in that gap at the top. Now the only thing that is bothering me at the moment is this panel. Now this is a dynacorn pre-built section here, this frame rail with the aprons in place and the shock tower delete. And what I've run into is on this side, this bracket, when it's in place, was hitting this bottom edge. Like I could not even put that in there because this was hitting. So I did some measuring, and this side fits nice. Nice gap there. That's about 3 paint sticks thick. But I did some measuring and I discovered that this one is a tighter distance. So you know, whenever they stamp these things, it's hard to say just how accurate they are. Like you can see this impression here is not parallel with this top piece, and this one is for the most part. So this thing may have been angled slightly when they were pressing it, I don't know. And when they put this in, I mean, they're kind of lining things up and putting them together. So what I'm going to end up doing is cutting out some material here. I put a line and I want to cut that and reshape this. The only thing I don't like about it is it affects this as far as looks. Like it would be ideal to have it look like this and still have some area around it, but it's just going to end up having to cut it up into this area. There's just no way to avoid that if you want the consistent shape. And I don't want to have a notch here, it doesn't make sense. So I'll clean that up and make it look nice. So I have to take that back out, take care of that. So the other thing I want to talk about is this. This is a sway bar mount, and you can see I've drawn a line, a center line in this thing, because in the instructions it tells you the sway bar bracket is mounted 12 inches from the front edge of the cross member to the center of the bracket. So basically they're showing a measurement there, tape measure up against 12 inches, and I have done that. I have measured and put in my line, which ends up here, so this will end up in there. So that'll get fully welded on both sides, and we're getting close to the finish. So let me get that trimmed up and refit, and we'll do some more welding. And now kind of the really fun part is welding this thick metal together completely. So what I've done is I've added some tack welds. So I went on the inner portion on both sides, and then I go to the outside and I do the same thing. I wanted to have it, you know, just be confident to where it was at and not have the vice grips or the clamps in the way. and it just, you know, makes it more comfortable whenever you're knowing that you're not going to have to move something in the middle of a weld. So I get everything set up and of course get the clamps out of the way, and then I start filling in those nice gaps. They're not a big gap, but it's, you know, it's enough that it's going to take more weld than normal, because the corner right there, that's actually on a curve. It's not a 90-degree plate. That thing is stamped, so it's got a curve to it, and you know, you got to fill in that gap right there where the curve is bigger. So that's not a problem. You know, just take your time. Make sure you've got a lot of movement with the whip to fill those gaps in, and then I move on to the inner portion of that, and I do the same thing. And you know, your welding technique can vary. Like I've discovered, for me, I weld better probably downhill and in a pushing motion when I'm welding across the top. So just keep that in mind when you're trying to develop your welding techniques, how the weld looks as you're moving through the area that you're trying to weld. So I'm technically pushing metal or rod or wire, I should say, into that gap and filling that in, rather than pulling it away from it, if that makes sense. So you know, the wire, it's going to flow regardless, but either you're pushing or you're pulling away. So I would say that's not going anywhere. I really do love welding this heavy steel. It is so nice. Now, the next thing that it tells us to do on this is to take this bolt out. Let's see if it'll come out. And now that the bolt is out of the way, it wants you to cut off this tab. And then the idea is you're going to weld shut the holes, one on the inside where the bolt was through, and this hole, and then finish welding all of this perimeter and blending it and make it look nice. So that'll be the next thing I do. I'll just take a Ziz wheel and work my way through that and get that tab off, and then finish welding it up. So what I have done is I've already welded the top section, and I took a cutoff wheel, and after removing that bolt, I cut out that tab and then ground this edge back in just to smooth it up. So I want to weld the perimeter here, the bottom, and this curve, but I also want to weld that hole shut. So I'm just going to start with that. That's pretty easy. This isn't right, just so you know. Don't. You can't weld with this. I recommend one of these, something along this line. Oh, that killed me. Completely unnecessary. I just wanted to do it. So this area here I want to do in short welds because I know it'll get hot and then I want to pull away from it. So I'm just going to do it in short segments. There we go. So now the last things to weld on are the sway bar mounts. 12 inches on center based off of the cross member, as I said earlier. So I'm just going to put a couple tacks on the ends just to hold it in place. And then weld each leg and then the center. That'll work. Well, at this point, everything is welded. I wanted to show this too. That's that gap that I created above that bracket. But everything is welded, and I know this isn't going anywhere, as we like to say. And if it does, that means something really, really bad has happened to this car. So the brackets are in. All this side is fully welded. Now, what I probably will do, just for appearance at this point, is I may go ahead and hang the control arm, maybe the shock and the upper control arm, just put this side together just to have a look at it, but I am not ready for all that stuff to be mounted just yet. Ideally, I want to take this off of the jig and get it up on the lift so I can work on the back of the car, and I may not want to have any of the front pieces on it, but I may just mock it up right now just for appearance. So I think it's looking really, really good. I'm very excited about it. I know I'm going to have to figure out what to do with the engine mounts and the cross member, and I may need to pursue the plastic engine as well, because I know it's going to be difficult to manipulate this into this location, but that's another reason why I want to leave the core support loose so that I can come through the front here without having to drop in from the top. So let me see if I can get these control arms on, and we'll take another look at it. I wanted to see just how well these pieces fit together. I've seen people have complaints about the gap on the lower control arm in particular, but the way this is designed, you know, it's got little washers that go in between everything, and it's a snug fit. So I have no complaints at all about the lower control arms. You can also note that there's a post sticking out on my left side there. That is where the sway bar connects to that lower control arm. Now the upper control arm, again, I haven't done one of these in a while, and I didn't really think about it, but if you have that filler piece in where the shock tower was, this isn't going to fit. So I ended up knocking the swing arm, you know, the center shaft, out of the control arm. And what I had to do is go over to the vise and pull these bushings out, the metal bushings, and then pull the plastic bushings out. And now I can take the control arm and put it around the bracket and then slide the pivot shaft or arm shaft into the control arm and then reset the bushings. Now, I'm not putting it together permanently. I'm just fitting it together. And I'll point out later, there's 4 bolts that are the silver bolts, and there's 4 bolts that are the gold bolts. And I'm assuming that they use these different lengths to adjust the upper control arm in and out, because I don't know what else, else you would have 4 different or 2 different length of bolts. Here I'm trying to put the shock in, and I'm trying to use one of those bolts from that upper control arm kit, and it doesn't fit. So the bolt itself doesn't go into the bracket, but it'll slide through the top of the shock. So I'm kind of confused by this, and I realized later on that I don't have the right hardware for that, the front shocks. So I set the spindle in place, and it just takes a little manipulating of the upper ball joint to get the angle right, to get it to drop in as normal whenever you're playing with these things. And nothing is going to be tight. Everything is just there for to look at. And I end up taking out, I have 2 4x4 blocks underneath. I take one of those out and put a 2x4 in, so it sits a little bit lower when I'm done with it. Okay, I'm not going to be able to go any further with this at the moment anyway, but I wanted to show you how this works. So lower control arm has that long bolt that goes through it, and in the instructions it says put the acorn nut to the front and then put a washer between that nut and this mating flange where the bushing goes. Do the same in the back. That upper control arm, they're the same, at least they appear the same. I don't see any markings that say left or right. They completely seem symmetrical, so I'm going to assume that they will fit either side. Now, I can't put it in here because there's no room, and what I ended up doing was taking the shaft out so that I could, as you saw, slip the control arm around and then put the shaft on the inside. Now what I've run into is a little bit of a problem. As you may have seen, I was trying to put the shock on, and I can't do that. So this kit here that has 4 bolts of one type and 4 bolts of another, that says U-arm bolt kit. So that's for the control arm. That would be the upper control arm. And they give you these different bolt lengths, I'm assuming, in case you have to add more space to get the suspension set up right. Because you don't adjust the bottom, you only adjust the top. So at this point, that's all that I have. I've looked through the other boxes, and I'll point this out. Here's the rack and pinion setup, and this kit was all in one bag. So you've got tie rod ends, you've got the sway bar mount here, this is the rack bolts, you got these rod ends, heim joints that'll connect to the sway bar, and a bolt kit for the sway bar bolt kit. No space, so no spacer, I guess. So all of this goes for the rack and pinion and the sway bar. Over here, everything here is for the back of the car. So all this is bagged for the back. There's the rear sway bar, other pieces and parts. And then we have the other spindle for the passenger side. That was the driver's side spindle. The other control arm. This is, I think, the master cylinder. And these are the shocks. So these shocks have bolts with them. They were in this, like a kit bag here, and they're exactly the same. And if you look, and it's hard to see, the ends of the shocks are a smaller diameter, and it's the same on both ends. It has a swivel connection here, and I've compared that to the mount point, which is here on this bar. So I know that this is the rear shocks. Also, these are rated. This says, I think, 500 pounds. So, and this one is 250. Now these, assuming, again, these are the front, there should be some bolts in here, but there's not. And I don't know, this box was opened, and the owner may have had it open to look at it and just, identify what was in here. Or, I don't know, it may have been something else going on, but this has a smaller diameter, and this has a larger diameter. And none of the bolts that I have correspond to fitting. I mean, they just don't they don't work. So you can see that's a little bit smaller down there and a little bigger there. Now the instructions, they say to the shock assembly, say let's see, the instructions say the shock assembly is installed next using the 1/2 inch bolts. The Rytec shocks mount with the threaded body on top and the adjuster facing the ball joint. So it's talking about that bottom end adjuster, and you can see that bolt looks a lot like the ones that were in the other shock kit. They have like a like an Allen head bolt. So I'm just assuming we're missing those bolts for the front. Not that it matters right now because I can't put all this together anyway. However, I want to show you this. I didn't realize that this kit comes with Ford modular mounts. So I showed that other kit, and maybe we didn't. Maybe I didn't realize that these mounts are already made for that engine. That is a big plus. So if you look at this, and it says it's tacked together, so it's up to us to finish weld this. See if I can place this. So basically, that's where that's going to go. Now, it's either one side or the other. Maybe, I don't know. We'll figure it out when we get there. But we have nice engine mounts, so I don't need to worry about that kit that I showed previously. But that's where we're at. I think things are looking really good, and that's where I'm going to have to stop this video. So here we are at the end of the video. Now all of these components they're in raw condition. There's no paint on them, no primer. So that's something I will have to address later on. I know on the Brooklyn Pony car that I did, I had powder coated everything. I don't know if we're going to do that just yet. There's other products out there and I may try something different, but I have to take care of all that as well. I also need to figure out what to do with the bolts for the shocks in the front, whether they're missing or we need to get another set or something. I know they're kind of specific the way they're made, so I may have to do some research on that. But I am looking forward to getting the car up in the air and getting the back section all together. And also, test fit, test fit, test fit. I say it all the time, and it pays off when you do all those things now versus whenever you're finished and there's something that's in a problem and you have to fix it. So keep that in mind. I also want to thank my patrons who continue to support me. I appreciate them so much. They keep me motivated and help me come out here and keep making these videos, and I think everybody benefits from that. So if you're interested in becoming a patron, there is a description in the box down below. There's also links to products like the yeswelder or any other product that I've used in the shop that I endorse, and there's links to my Amazon page. So take a look at those if you're interested, but that'll be it for this video. So until next time, take care of yourselves. See ya. We all live in a yellow submarine, a yellow submarine, a yellow submarine. With that in mind, I can now assume, working on blah blah blah, completely to each blah blah. So at this point, all three of these pieces are that's pretty easy. This isn't right. Just so you know. Don't